I'm Chaz Kalenda, and I'm running to be the next Rhode Island Attorney General. I've practiced law for the last 16 years, 12 of them in the office of the Attorney General, so I have the knowledge and experience to do that job at a high level. I'm not here to fight for a political agenda. I'm not here to fight for a special interest. I'm here to fight for the rights of every Rhode Islander, no matter where you come from or no matter what your background is. I'll need your votes on September 13th for the primary election and November 8th for the general election. If you have any questions about where to vote or how to vote, please contact your local Board of Canvassers or the Secretary of State's office or website. I'm not running to be just another politician. I'm running to be a public servant who can serve as a much-needed check and balance on the state of Rhode Island to root out the corruption both inside and outside of our system. We need your support. You can visit my website at chas4ag.com to learn more about me, donate, or volunteer your time. I'm Chaz Kalenda, and I approve this message.
To take home the Golden Gloves, you've got to put in the work, and you've got to be tough as nails. Ashley Kalis was driven to achieve. Today, Kalis is still fueled by that same hope, grit, and determination. A mother of 3 school-aged boys and successful business owner who ran testing and vaccination sites across the state. Kalis is the fighter Rhode Island needs right now because it's time for a change. Ashley Kalis for governor.
Good evening. Welcome back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Tsukerman. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. With us today is Michael Hilliard. He's been a journalist in Central Asia. He is now an Australian foreign policy advisor and a host of 2 podcasts, one focusing on Central Asia and the other, Red Line, discusses all sorts of global and geopolitical matters with speakers from all over the world. And of course, he's been doing a lot of academic and other work related to his interest in Central Asia and other global issues. Michael, welcome to the Washington Outsider Report.
It's an absolute pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Before we launch into today's topic, which is to discuss the events surrounding Central Asia, an area that in the United States in particular, but also in many Western countries, has been fairly overlooked up until this point. I just wanted to ask you a few questions to introduce yourself, your work, how you ended up in Central Asia, and what brings you to all these journalistic activities and policy activities now, before discussing.
So before I was in sort of the policy sphere, I was a conflict journalist. So mostly covering wars in Ukraine, Iran, and the Caucasus, and obviously the Russian-speaking areas. And enjoying the Russian-speaking areas, I took a couple of trips to Central Asia as well, as there's obviously fighting and tension going in there a lot of the time, and really loved it. It's a fascinating area of the world, and it's just not covered, which is what I thought was really interesting about it. It's even when you speak to guys who are, Asia specialists or they're Russia specialists, or it just falls down the cracks a lot, and people tend to forget that this huge, massive land with lots of gas and oil and culture and all sorts of stuff is just left away because everyone kind of the Russia guys don't really focus too much on it. The Asia guys tend to sort of think Asia ends at the Chinese border. The Indian Ocean guys don't view it because it's obviously a landlocked area. And the Middle East guys tend to sort of end the Middle East at Iran. So it kind of sits in that, it's the couple of gold coins in amongst the couch that, everyone tends to miss.
Economically and geopolitically, Central Asia has been growing in importance from security issues such as Islamic State recruitment from that vicinity to latest issues over energy and Russia's involvement and circumvention of sanctions to Iran's interest in that area. There's a lot going on, and yet we have not really seen a lot of shift, whether through academic resources or through policy, government policy shifts. Why is there a continuing blind spot despite the growing importance to current events?
I think it's a combination of the fact that there's not a lot of funding or grants for people to go out there. It's quite far outside most people's spheres. The languages can be quite difficult. It's not the nicest place, if you want to be, if you're a bit precious about where you want to go. I know quite a lot of academics who, when they cover Russia, they'll never leave the sort of very nice bits of Moscow. And that, asking them to go out to Almaty, which is a lovely town, a lovely city, should I say. A lot of them don't want to do that. And I think it does fall down a lot of that, that problem. And we also haven't really thought about it as a important player, to most people who kind of follow much wider geopolitics, because people think, oh, well, it's setting Soviet, it's probably Russia aligned, that's where the story ends. But it's far more complicated than that. And again, just no one tends to pay attention because everyone's obviously focused on China or Moscow or America or the EU mostly.
Two of the most important recent geopolitical developments concerning that general vicinity has been the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the recent summit of 15 countries in Samarkand in Uzbekistan. These two developments are mostly being covered as economic and political bloc developments, but there are also significant security and defense related opportunities for these countries. Let's start with the Shanghai organization that's basically led by Russia and China, despite the fact that the two countries are basically rivals in Central Asia, and despite the fact that some of the other participants are rivals among each other. You have Armenia and Azerbaijan, you have India and Pakistan, you have Turkey, which has had both tensions and friendship and alliances with both Russia and Iran and even China. What's going on? How have all these countries been able to get together and overcome their differences?
So a lot of the reasons that you guys overcome the differences is it is a prisoner of geography, to use that term. And I do like that term. A lot of these countries have no other choice on where they send their goods if they want to export their goods. So they have to work together. And Central Asia really does, have to work together to actually get along and survive. Just as a classic example, if you look at Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and Turkmenistan, they're desperate for water, but they have lots of gas. Whereas Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan have lots of water, but they have no gas. So they have to do things like that to intermingle and work together. But this Shanghai Cooperation Organization was, so many big headlines in one space. It was the first time Xi had left China since the beginning of the pandemic, which again, it says quite a lot that his first trip is into Central Asia, about his, his importance on Central Asia. And I remind everyone all the time that Xi announced the Belt and Road in Kazakhstan. It was the first, he said that at Nazarbayev University. It's he takes Central Asia quite seriously. Whilst the Shanghai Cooperation Organization was going on, there was a border skirmish between Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, which the two leaders were sitting in a room with each other whilst their forces were fighting. And it was some of the most intense fighting we'd seen in quite a while. It's the first time that, for instance, the Tajiks have used, tanks and guns and heavy mortars on these border clashes. Usually it's just some rock throwing and a few shots fired here and there. Armenia and Azerbaijan were currently, in full engagement at that point, which again, this is the first time that Azerbaijan has actually fired shells into Armenia proper, rather than just fighting over the Karabakh, enclave. So yeah, it was a very, very tense time, and obviously the war in Ukraine hung over everyone's head as well, because it does affect these guys quite a lot. A lot of their money came from Russian money that comes back. Tajikistan, for instance, gets about 30 to 40% of its economy just from Tajiks going off to work in Russia and sending remittances home. So the strength of the Russian economy is very important to the Central Asians. And if you're someone like Kazakhstan or Kyrgyzstan, you want to get your products into the European markets, you usually have to go through Russia. All the pipelines go through Russia. And if Russia's been sanctioned, then you've just been cut from the European markets, even for something that you maybe had nothing to do with. So it's a very, very tense time in Central Asia. And it was a huge amount of, world-shaping headlines at this old historic city in Uzbekistan.
What? Actually, let's back up for a moment. Russia and China have both been playing an incredibly important role in those countries, but who has been, would you say, a more important player? And is there more of a cooperation or more of a tension now between these two influencers?
So this is the $1 million question. This is what everyone is looking at for Central Asia, because there is a competition between Russia and China in the area. And whilst China has put lots and lots of money in, and they do really well with the oligarchs and the very rich people in Central Asia, they haven't had as much impact in the cultural parts of Central Asia. Whereas the Russians still have a lot of cultural impact, but more and more they're losing their influence in, a lot of the monetary projects. Most of the new dams or, big roads or highways or infrastructure is being built with Chinese money. But when coups happen or defense problems happen, everybody turns to Moscow. So Moscow is still the defense arbiter of the region, including that when you go around the region, there are different languages that people will speak, but Russian is still the lingua franca, particularly with people above the age of 30. So that is going to have an impact when, if you're an Uzbek and you need to go into Kyrgyzstan and do some business or do what you need to do, Russian will still likely be the language you'll be communicating in. Which will always have a big impact on how they view that country. So yeah, it's very odd to see that China is very big with security services. They're very big with infrastructure. They are building the highways. They are pumping money into Central Asia, but they just haven't got the cultural foothold that Russia still has in the region. And particularly in Kyrgyzstan and some bits of Kazakhstan, there is still a lot of Sinophobia in the country.
Do you? Some of these countries have been trying to throw off the shackles of the Soviet era and kind of shift away from Russian influence, whether it's linguistic or cultural or just business and their presence. But the war in Ukraine may have disrupted a lot of it. I'm hearing very mixed reports about Kazakhstan, for instance, because on the surface, Kazakhstan is distancing itself from Russia, trying to be pro-Western, trying to lend support to Ukraine, and has rejected Russia's pressure to send troops to Ukraine. But from what I'm hearing from minorities living in Kazakhstan, a lot of the government institutions are very much infiltrated by pro-Russian sentiments and elements, and domestically, the picture is not what it appears to be to the public outside. How would you assess this apparent contradiction?
It's a really complicated situation for Kazakhstan right now. And to go back, we have to lay a little groundwork here. Kazakhstan was ruled, before the Soviet Union fell, by a guy named Nursultan Nazarbayev, who was president from like 85, 88, depending on what you call a president, right through to effectively 2020 or 2019, sorry. He ruled the country with an iron fist. He made his family very wealthy. He was very corrupt. And he effectively ran the country like his fiefdom. There were protests in 2020, and Nazarbayev knew that, no, I can't hold it off anymore, and handpicked Tokayev, this guy named Kassym-Jomart Tokayev, who's the current president, and said, this is my handpicked successor. He won the election, and Tokayev was put in power, but was given you're in power, but I still have the right to veto any, because he gave himself this role of Elbasi, like father of the nation, where he still had rights to veto any government appointments. He renamed the capital to his first name, which would be like Trump getting kicked out of Washington and renaming Washington Donald. It's very weird. He still kept, his seat on the National Security Council and, put his children in lots of telecommunications companies and all sorts of stuff. Fast forward to 2022, and there's huge protests in Kazakhstan, and the government is stormed, effectively throwing out, everyone went, no more Nazarbayev. It started as a protest about fuel prices because the government took away the subsidies and just exploded from there. Everyone went, this is ridiculous. It was a bit of a perfect storm with these protests because it was on the 10-year anniversary of when Nazarbayev shot a bunch of oil workers in the West. A bunch of stories had come out with Nazarbayev's relatives using, whilst the country's rolling blackouts in the middle of winter, they were using the power stations to mine Bitcoin. And then on top of that, this fuel subsidy came off. Protests happened. Everyone went, that's it. We're done with Nazarbayev. And Tokayev had to the whole government had to effectively get rid of everyone. But then there's a question of who becomes president. So Tokayev, because Tokayev is in this authoritarian state, he's really the only one who has national recognition. And if Tokayev was to go, it becomes a free-for-all with 12 or 15 oligarchs. And the Russians, the Kazakhs, everyone kind of went, well, Tokayev's probably the only one who can hold the reins steady in Kazakhstan. He'll stay. Most of the rest of the government goes. Now Tokayev is trying to make his own legacy. He doesn't have Nazarbayev, really pulling the strings like he used to. So he's stuck in this position of he doesn't want to be pro-Russia because he needs to prove himself as a Kazakh national, as someone who is pro-Kazakhstan. And again, he speaks fluent Mandarin. He's been very good with the Chinese. He's been quite, open to a lot of international business. And he wants to put that out, and he wants Western money, he wants Chinese money, he wants to bring Kazakhstan out from underneath Russia. But at the same time, Kazakhstan also has Russia is its security guarantor. And when those riots happened in January, it was Russian troops that came and kept his regime up. There are huge populations of Russians in the north of the country, in towns like Petropavlovsk and Semoy. So there could be a bit of an enclave problem there. And again, it comes down to this geographic problem that the majority of stuff imported into Kazakhstan will come in through Russia because Kazakhstan has no port apart from on the Caspian Sea, which is landlocked. So they still need to get a lot of stuff from Russia. They still trade heavily with Russia. They still use Russia for most of their truckers. A lot of people work in Russia. They've got large Russian enclaves. Russia gives them the defense guarantees. So he has this kind of trying to spin two plates at once, where he's trying to prove to the Kazakhs that he is pro-Kazakh, he is a Kazakh nationalist, and he's not a Nazarbayev clone. But he's also having to prove to the Russians that, hey, I'm a good partner and I'm here to help. And I'm not here to rock the boat because I get Russia's role in Central Asia. And that's where we sit. So he'll do things like make big statements that sound big to Western press. His big statement of, we will not recognize the Ukrainian, we will not recognize Ukrainian referendums. But then again, Kazakhstan doesn't recognize Kosovo, and they don't recognize Catalonia, and they don't recognize Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Transnistria. They just don't. They tend to don't recognize anyone's borders and play it neutral anyway. So there's been a lot of loud noises that the West has really jumped on, but policy-wise, there's been some moves in the right direction, but not nearly as much as I think people think there has been. But still, it's the furthest from Russia Kazakhstan has ever been, and it is going in that direction. But them being enemies, or them sort of that relationship broken in half, I think is still a while away.
Mm-hmm. And that brings me to another issue that may cause even more complications, which is the presence of a significant Uyghur population inside the country. Some of them have complained of discriminatory treatment, at least on the street level. And now with Kazakhstan trying to appeal to China, and China being essentially accused of a genocide of the Uyghur population inside its own borders, how is that working out?
For the majority, sadly, it's all just swept under the rug. China doesn't want to bring it up because obviously there are Uyghur populations inside Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan. There are some in Uzbekistan, but not nearly as many as the other two. And Central Asia doesn't want to really bring it up either because there is tension. There are those border towns where, a fight at a high school has broken out into sort of, a 50, 60 person brawl in these kind of border towns. But Kazakhstan is so desperate for another trade partner. If Russia is the only person who use your trade partner, not a great position. So they want China, they want assistance and help and money and support. So they don't really poke that bear too much, because they know it's not going to get them anywhere with China. China, the moment you bring up, what's happening in Xinjiang, and I've been to Xinjiang, and it is quite awful what's happening out there, the Chinese will immediately shut the conversation down. So, so again, Central Asia knows its position, that it wants to be, step out on the world stage and be more in front of people, but it is landlocked. It's stuck between Russia and China. And if you're, let's say, in Uzbekistan or Turkmenistan, you either have to go through Russia to get to Europe, or you go through China, to which you then need to work with all the Central Asians, or you have to go through Iran and Afghanistan, both of which Iran's under sanctions and Afghanistan is too unstable to be able to build pipelines through the country. So these guys know that Russia and China are the only games in town, and they're stuck with that set of cards.
Do you see Russia or China trying to work closer with the Taliban to stabilize the country enough to build another pipeline?
So speaking with Russian military leaders over my time, Afghanistan is regularly referred to as a swirling pit of doom. And as many Russians fear NATO, I think there's a lot more that fear Afghanistan. Which is why Ukraine's conflict, the Russians were pulling troops off almost every front, and until recently had left Tajikistan's deployment untouched until quite recently. It shows you where their priorities really are. Afghanistan is in a really interesting position that, there's so little money in the country at the moment. Their budget is what, like from memory says, it was $550 million last year, which is tiny. It's like, a couple of big budget movies for the whole country. And there's a huge liquidity crisis. In Kabul at the moment, there's big problems where you can get food. The shelves are full, but because there's so many sanctions still on Iran and some of the Taliban government, people can't actually get the money out of the bank, which leads to a whole other set of crises. Every country is now stuck in this region, is now stuck in a bit of a dilemma of, okay, do we work with this? Do we work with the Taliban and try and stabilize the country, to which we then have to deal with the Taliban full time? Or do we let the Taliban collapse and we probably have ISIS-K or another extremist group come into play and it becomes even more unstable? That's really a big question. And the Taliban don't have full control of the country. They're not, particularly in the west of the country, they don't have ironclad control. So it makes any investor, if you're saying, hey, I want you to build a pipeline from Turkmenistan down to India and Pakistan, they will go, well, I don't know if I feel comfortable putting $150 million into Afghanistan at the moment. So China, I think the best phrase I've heard on this from the Chinese is, the Americans smash the teapot, but it's on our side of the table, because China does have a direct border with Afghanistan. And if problems unroll from Afghanistan, they're going to get into Tajikistan, and then from Tajikistan, they're into China. And China does severely worry about that. So they need to keep Afghanistan at least somewhat put together, and make sure Tajikistan is kind of the front line, that the problems are on Tajikistan's border and not in China's backyard. So Russia and China are taking Afghanistan very seriously. Can they build a pipeline? I would be surprised if a pipeline comes in the next decade. I think it's been everyone's, big hope for the country. But, speaking with, locals and government officials, as well as people from energy companies who do specialize in this region, all of them are saying, no, we need to see significant improvements from Afghanistan for stability before we would feel comfortable putting flammable pipelines through the country.
What do you think is going to happen to those resources for the lack of pipelines, given that they're desperately needed? There is a crisis going on. There is this opportunity, and then you have groups of unstable state and non-state actors around that can also misuse this in various ways. Let's say imagine ISIS getting their hands on the oil in the area. That's not a positive development for anyone.
It would be difficult for ISIS to get a really good hold in the country. Looking at the sort of the border states and where they would, the Iranians are pretty, they clamp down pretty hard on ISIS. Afghanistan, ISIS has been firing some shells into Uzbekistan, and they have been firing a little bit of shell into Iran, and they've made some tensions with Tajikistan. But the Tajiks have got enough on their plate, that, and the ISIS don't have the ethnic ties to get in there very well. The Uzbeks are under, have defended that border quite well, and they, the areas that ISIS has been shelling are pretty much deserts. And Turkmenistan is not, in most major countries, there's kind of lots of cities that are, you leave one city and you kind of enter the next. Turkmenistan's kind of almost like an archipelago. It's 5 really big cities and a whole bunch of desert in the middle. So it makes, operatives like ISIS very difficult to actually get out there. Also knowing the fact that if ISIS were to cross into Turkmenistan or into Uzbekistan in any great number, the Russians, the Chinese, and likely the Americans, who have also run army drills in this area of the world, would very quickly make sure that that doesn't get much further. But ISIS-K, I think, particularly ISIS-K, which operates in the west of Afghanistan and so the east of Iran, is not particularly strong. I mean, if we're talking Taliban running around with $550 or $450 million per year, these guys are probably running around with 10, maybe 15. It's very, very low numbers, and they're using very, very low tech. So not a great threat to the Central Asians at this point, but definitely something that people in the region are keeping an eye on.
Now, the Central Asians have their own dilemmas, which is as you mentioned earlier, sanctions. Do you see them trying to use Taliban as a kind of an intermediary to circumvent sanctions for the time being?
Yes. So both, the sanctions in the north and sanctions in the south. Right now, it's really interesting to see. Obviously, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan and these countries have said they will comply with international sanctions against Russia, and they have been pretty good about it. But at the same time, if Russia needs things like specialty airplane parts, Kazakhstan will not endorse those parts crossing the border, but they might just leave the border a little bit undermanned that day. If again, it's not a whole. There's a lot of allegations, and there's very little proof. But yeah, there's lots of first-hand accounts from people doing that. When it comes to Taliban sanctions, there's a little bit, but again, the Taliban aren't really giving the Central Asians much money to work with anyway. In fact, the majority of the time the Taliban are sending money towards Central Asia, it's because the Central Asians have connected their power group with Afghanistan's. And in fact, most of the time when they pay off one of the Central Asians, particularly Uzbekistan, it's saying to Tajikistan, I'm really sorry, I'm late on my bills. I'll pay Uzbekistan today. I'll pay you next week. And then I'll pay Uzbekistan back the week after. Again, we're dealing with very, very small amounts of money. So Central Asia is going to try and do what they can, but getting around sanctions, I don't even see, too much of where the Afghans are going to actually be able to afford things that would be worth sanctioning anyway.
Oh, I don't mean in their own capacity, but essentially as intermediaries between Russia and Central Asia, for lack of other routes at the moment.
Sorry, can you repeat that question?
I mean, as intermediaries between Russia and Central Asia, as basically smuggling routes through Afghanistan for the parts that they needed, and other things, whatever they may be.
So for a very long time, drugs and contraband have been smuggled out of Afghanistan, and they travel into Tajikistan into sort of China and Asia and Europe and Russia. It's been really interesting to watch that road, because generally there's been this recent sort of phenomenon over the last decade or so where Chinese and Russians will let the Afghans and the Taliban come into Tajikistan and drop off their heroin, and then a Tajik will pick it up and take it the rest of the way, because the Russians are stuck in this position of, okay, if we stop the heroin, the Taliban will change their smuggling routes and we may not know where they are, and they may get through, and we have Taliban in Central Asia. If we stick with this method of, the Taliban dropping the heroin at the border, the Tajiks pick it up and then walk it the rest of the way, there's drugs and heroin and all sorts of stuff coming in, but there isn't terrorism coming in. And that's the compromise that both Russia and China seem to be making at this point is, drugs, we'll live with it. Terrorism, no thank you.
So it's interesting because the Taliban made a big deal out of announcing their war on drugs, so to speak, and the ban of the growth of puppies and so forth. So, in reality, the situation appears to be more complicated. And in the past, the Taliban has been a significant client of the very warlords it claims to be fighting. What's the real agenda here?
See, the trouble with heroin in Afghanistan is it's a very, very easy crop to grow. And when you speak to farmers out in Afghanistan, and you have the same problem with coca farmers out in South America, they have two choices. They can grow heroin and make this much money, or they can grow corn and they make this much money. And with growing heroin, there will be a drug dealer who will come to your farm and he will pick up the heroin on time, and he will take the heroin and he will pay you cash, and it will be an easy transaction. When you grow corn, you're expected to harvest the corn, package it yourself, get it to the market to which the infrastructure is not there. And if you don't sell all your corn and it goes rotten at market, you've just lost the money on that. So Afghan farmers, have been stuck in this position of, even if they don't want to grow heroin, maybe, I need some money, it's an easy crop, and at least that way I know I can sell it and there will be a guy come to my house and collect it. And that's the trouble it is, that until we can get sort of good markets in place, locals who will buy the crop, and it be profitable enough for Afghan farmers, heroin's still going to be a very staple crop inside Afghanistan.
Well, interestingly enough, yesterday Russia and Afghanistan Taliban concluded a significant deal. Now, many people are wondering what's Russia getting out of it other than raisins and medicinal herbs. And why would they want to be helpful there anyway? What is it that Russia is seeking out of Taliban at this point?
So Russia right now is desperate for international friends. It feels like a bit of a pariah state, and having anyone that will say, "Yep, Russia's fine," is good for Moscow at the moment. It's also very cheap. We're dealing with such small numbers that if Russia throws $10 million at them, for Russia, that's nothing. That's a drop in the bucket. But for the Afghans, that actually is a decent little payday for them. At least then, if they are getting involved, and I haven't read the text of the deal yet, and I will be doing that later on tonight. But at least if the Russians know what the Taliban are doing with their heroin, they have a better idea on the scope and the purity and what's coming out. But generally, what else are you going to buy from the Afghans at the moment? If you want to invest money and build better relations and get in with the Afghan government, which is very important, because if you want that government to be able to pass on information of who the terrorists are, where they are, what's happening, you need to be on good terms with them. This is the way to do it. You need to start trade relations. You need to make sure the Afghan government has enough money to actually keep afloat so it doesn't collapse into something worse. And again, it's a very small deal. It's very cheap, and for Russia, it gets in someone else who won't yell at them at international conferences.
It would be a very ironic development to see Russia legitimize Taliban and work together on counterterrorism operations against ISIS, which has actually targeted the Russian embassy in Afghanistan after everything that's happened. But we have seen some very strange bedfellows lately. Before we get into these very strange alliances a little bit more, I wanted to ask you about another development concerning Russia, which may have a lot of impact on Central Asia and the Caucasus and other places, which was Putin's recent announcement of the new Russian foreign policy, which essentially would allow it to go anywhere in the world with a significant Russian ethnic population and defend their human rights from oppression. Now, I found that the timing for this announcement very curious, given Russia's complete lack of success in Ukraine under the same pretense. What do you make of its timing? And actually, this story did not receive all that much coverage for various reasons, but.
Again, Russia's trying to bolster, puff their chest up a bit. A lot of Russia analysts, very much overestimated Russia's strength and its aggression strength. So a lot of the countries that have been held in check by, well, I don't want to annoy Russia because they're very strong, kind of now go, well, maybe Russia isn't as strong as we think, and this is particularly evident with Armenia and Azerbaijan. If you told me 2 years ago, Azerbaijan would never have the guts to go attack Armenia proper, because that would usually trigger a Russia response. And they went, Russia's far too strong. Nope. Now they're getting more gutsy with it because they know Russia doesn't have the troops or the effort or the manpower to really go for those big pushes into Armenia if they really wanted to, or into Azerbaijan, sorry. This move is not really meant for you and me. I don't think the Russians are actually going to move into any of these countries, but it will strike fear in some of the particularly older populations in Moldova, in Kazakhstan, in Kyrgyzstan, in Mongolia to a lesser extent, into Azerbaijan, into Armenia, and into Belarus, Latvia kind of, but it's very kind of iffy on that one. And some of the Arctic territories like Svalbard. Will the Russians actually do it? No, but it does. If you are a foreign minister of any of those countries, you have to take that into your calculations going, well, if we were thinking about leaving the CST, or we were thinking about, jumping ship and leaving all the Russia-aligned organizations, maybe we shouldn't if Russia's going to be, using this doctrine of we will defend any Russians in here. Because again, that has been standard doctrine for quite a long time. The Russians went into Georgia on a very similar characteristic of we're here to defend Russians, and they had a lot of passports beforehand as well. So it's not particularly different from what Russian policy is, but yeah, I don't think it's I wouldn't be putting too much stock in it.
We have seen that some of the Baltic states have actually tried to ban Russians from asylum-seeking Russians from entering the country, but Kazakhstan has not. And of course, in Georgia, the situation is that there are significant Russian population already causing all sorts of internal issues. To what extent can Russia continue weaponizing existing enclaves as they did with the separatists in Ukraine?
See, it really depends. Like it depends what they're, it's a method to do foreign policy. It's not the reason for foreign policy. The Russians that were living in Ukraine had been there long before Russia, declared Luhansk and Donetsk to be separatist republics. The Russians living in Transnistria were there long before Russia declared that to be a breakaway republic. It's a method of doing so. So yes, if you're Kazakhstan particularly, you have these large ethnic Russian populations along the border, and that, will play into your calculations. But nothing's changed. Russia will look at Kazakhstan and go, is it advantageous to invade Kazakhstan? Probably not. They're not going to get much out of that. There's much more of an argument. I think invading Ukraine was a terrible idea, and I've been saying that since the very, very start. But I can see, when you speak to Russian officers about it, they can at least justify it in their heads that we're keeping them away from the Russian heartland and rah rah rah. Invading Kazakhstan is, it's off the books. And when you speak to, apart from some very, very, very out there Russian politicians, not a lot of people have any appetite for it.
On the other side of all of this is Turkey, which claims a lot of cultural heritage ties to many of the Central Asian countries, but has not been nearly as much of a factor until recently, either economically or security-wise. Can we discuss why that would be, and whether you see that changing in response to all these developments?
So Turkey's in a really interesting position. It really does sit at the center of the world, that it wants to be viewed as European, but it's had the door to EU membership closed for years, and it is kind of always shunned by the EU. It wants to expand into the Mediterranean. Obviously, there's a Cyprus conflict. There's a lot of tension over some of the Mediterranean gas fields. That's been going quite well for them. Their PMCs have been operating in Somalia and Libya, quite well. They want to get involved in the Middle East, but obviously don't want to side with the Saudis and annoy the Iranians, who share a significant, share borders and share all sorts of stuff. But they also don't want to side with the Iranians and annoy the Saudis. So they're trying to, work with everyone at the same time as trying to expand. And expand is probably not the right word, but trying to re-put themselves as a major player in this region. When it comes to Central Asia, yes, they love that. They love to go to the Turkic Council and stand hand in hand with, Japarov and Central Asian leaders and shake their hands. But they also know that, what are you hoping to gain from this? As we've seen with, even with China, who's put a lot of money into Central Asia, they haven't bought the influence they thought they probably would have. When it comes to, Russia's influence in the region, it's going to be pretty hard to debunk that. And Turkey can maybe do that, over the very, very, very long term. But again, if you're looking at where Turkey wants to spend its money and going, okay, for this dollar I have, and again, Turkey's economy is not in a good spot at the moment, so their dollars don't go nearly as far as they should. Where would you going to put that dollar? Well, Central Asia doesn't give you the best return. Let's go to spend in the Middle East or in Africa or in Europe. But they'd love to have a good relationship with Central Asia. They'll, anytime there's any Turkic event, Erdogan will show up and talk about the brotherhood and talk about, shared histories and museums and all sorts of stuff. But, it's still got a very long way to go before, Turkey is as important a player as Russia and China, because again, the Central Asians don't need Turkey. They don't have that geographic problem like they do with Russia and China, where they have to send, goods through them. With Turkey, they would either have to go across the Caspian, either go through Russia, which, well, what's the point then anyway? Through Iran, which then you're going to get sanctioned, and the Iranians aren't particularly friendly with the Central Asians, depending on who you talk to, or across the Caspian, which means getting things from effectively in the sort of eastern bits of Central Asia, which are where the populations are, all the way on a truck, all the way through the desert to the Caspian, onto a port in the Caspian, which the infrastructure is not great, all the way to Azerbaijan, and then offloading Azerbaijan, and then across onto their railways. It's a real pain, and it's, again, if you're Central Asians and you would have dollars down on who you want to put good relationships with, Turkey's great. It sounds great. It's attractive, but it's not the best bang for buck at the moment.
Meanwhile, one of the lesser discussed big winners in Central Asia, at least as some analysts have put it, has been Iran, which has, despite its recent internal upheaval, has on a geopolitical level been very much insinuating itself into all sorts of regional alliances and relationships. Can we talk about more about Iran's growing role in Central Asia, and what is it seeking to accomplish?
Again, partners. It was a really interesting period for Iran in sort of when around the sort of 2010, 2012, when the deal with Obama, the JCPOA, came through. When that deal opened and international business came into Iran, it was the best standard of living and best economy Iran had seen in a very long time, probably ever. Businesses were starting up there, international companies were starting up there. It was, this living standard of Iranians went up. And because of it, most Iranians were choosing more progressive policies. We started to see the moderates in Iran gain lots of seats in their parliament. It was good times for Iran, really. Then when Trump ripped up that deal, everything went sour, because companies, particularly French automotive companies, German energy companies, were told, get out of Iran in 60 days or we stop trading with you. And German companies would either have to decide to trade with the United States or with Iran. And they chose the United States. So what happened is all these big, car factories and everything that were built up in Iran were sold to the Chinese for pennies on the dollar. And Iran's now in this position of going, okay, I don't like how reliant we're becoming on China. I don't like how reliant we are on Russia for technology. Let's make some more partners. And if you look around at who Iran can actually partner up with, or who will accept that, you can't go to the West because the Americans will kick off still. You can't go to India as much. There's still tension there. China's already far too invested. So you look at Central Asia, and it's a win-win. So for Turkmenistan, for instance, we are at a point where 92% of their gas exports go to China, just China. And when China is 92% of your entire market, they set the price. China goes, I'm not paying that much, I'll pay this. And Turkmenistan has no choice anymore. Turkmenistan would love to be able to send their gas southward, toward the Indian Ocean and then out to other players, because they have the 6th largest gas reserves in the entire world. They have gas reserves at the same level as Qatar, but they have the GDP per capita of Gabon in Central Africa. It's not a good position to be in. They would love to export more gas, but how do you do that? You can't go through Kazakhstan or Russia because they sell gas as well. No one wants it. They can't go through Afghanistan, as we discussed earlier. So Iran's really the only option. But A, Iran sells natural gas itself and it's a major exporter. And B, it's under sanctions. And it gets really dicey on, will that Turkmen gas then be sanctioned because it's coming through Iran? So Iran would like to have a better relationship. They've had a pretty frosty relationship with the Turkmen for a very long time. The Turkmen are a very secretive government. But yeah, again, they look for any partner they can. If Central Asian money wants to pour in, they'd love to see it. But, it's still a long way off Central Asia, replacing what the Germans and the French and the British and everyone else put into their economy when the JCPOA was signed.
So in that sense, do you see Central Asia potentially as the next front for sanctions circumvention for energy, particularly, but other also materials for Iran and its new partners or potential
It's
new
possible.
partners?
It's possible, but it's also a large risk for these countries. Iran selling, the pipelines that come from Central Asia almost all head to either Russia or China. If the Iranians want to sell stuff to Russia, they'll probably go on the west coast of the Caspian. They'll go up through Azerbaijan, and they'll go in through sort of the west coast of the Caspian Sea, up past Astrakhan and into the Russian heartland. If they want to sell to China, then they're already doing that mostly via ship, or they'll tap into the Turkmen pipelines if they need to. But again, most of it comes by ship. So there's not really a huge incentive to use Central Asia to get past sanctions. And the Central Asians also don't want to go down that road, because if they get caught and they get sanctioned, they really are in some economic trouble. The economies in some of these Central Asian countries aren't fantastic. And it's a huge risk to take for a measly amount of gas that Iran would probably pump down those pipelines.
So meanwhile, Iran is also having a very interesting development with the port of Chabahar, which it has attempted to develop along with India, and India has invited Armenia to participate in the project. Now, Iran has had fairly good relations with Armenia on trade and energy issues. It has had complicated relationships with Azerbaijan, primarily because of its own Azerbaijani population and internal issues. But inviting Armenia to work on the project, it seems, will only alienate Azerbaijan even more from both Iran and India. What do you think is going on? What is Iran trying to accomplish? Why has it taken such an aggressive approach, which only created further tensions? And why would it not try to bring Azerbaijan more to its camps rather than turning to Armenia and actually enhancing the existing issues?
And I think you hit the nail on the head earlier on when you said it's the large population. Major cities in the sort of northwest of Iran, like Tabriz particularly, are almost majority ethnic Azeris. Huge amount of Azeris sitting in Iran. So Iran has this Goldilocks problem of, okay, if Azerbaijan is too weak, then that's a problem, because we need them to be pumping gas through. We need them to help, keep the markets going and rah, rah, rah. But if it's too strong, then they may, if they may talk about, well, maybe this should belong to Azerbaijan rather than belong to Iran. Those conversations start with Azeri nationalists. So Iran has a bit of an incentive to make sure that Azerbaijan is kind of kept in that Goldilocks middle zone. As for Armenia, they like to have good relations. And, even when the last conflict happened in 2020, when the big push into Nagorno-Karabakh happened, the Iranians were rushing, tanks and support to give to the Armenians until the Azeris really put their foot down, and the Russians said, don't flare this up anymore. And the Russians and the Iranians stopped sending their stuff. This is, the Iranians would like to see a stronger Armenia, because it does hold Azerbaijan in check. But Armenia is not in a good position. The COVID just ravaged the country. This new war has done huge damage to the country, and there's just economic instability. A lot of companies have fled as well. It's especially with Armenia, who again doesn't have a lot of natural resources and used to rely on Russia for a lot of its business. And Russia's kind of busy at the moment, to put it mildly.
Do you see Iran potentially becoming a new patron for Armenia if Russia is weakened even further by the war and sanctions and whatever else?
I don't think it will replace the role of Russia. Russia will always keep their bases, and Armenia is part of the CSTO. They might put more influence and money in, but again, what does Armenia have that Iran really needs? Iran would like to use Armenia maybe to get more avenues of smuggling and more avenues of entry into sort of Syria and into Lebanon and other ways in. that avoid Iraq or parts of Syria. But again, it's if you look at where your dollars and donuts are going, Armenia is not really that significant to the Iranians. It's great to have, and it's if you look at particularly the Chabahar deal, if the Armenians came to the table and said, yeah, let me chuck $10 million in and I'll be there at the ribbon cutting ceremony, Iran doesn't really lose much by letting him be there. It's no skin in the game at the moment for that. So will it be a huge move by Iran? Probably not. But they also have no objectives to forming much closer ties with Armenia as well.
Interestingly, the U.S. has not actually sanctioned the port, despite the obvious concerns about smuggling and so forth. What do you think is going to happen with that port? What direction do you see? What role do you think it's playing? And why has the U.S. been so lax in that regard, given the overall, implications?
So Chabahar is a really interesting position because it's right there in the kind of southeast of Iran, and it sits in, ethnically Baluch territory, which Baluchistan, the Baluch are kind of an ethnic group that sit over the southern kind of quarter of Pakistan and a bit of Afghanistan, just a little bit, and the very southeast corner of Iran. Chabahar was bringing jobs and investment into that area, which it was desperately needing, because again, there were a lot of terrorism groups coming out who were just frustrated with this local situation. Particularly in the Pakistani side, they'd seen these big investment projects that were supposed to bring lots of, ports and good support to the people in Baluchistan, which ended up going to Chinese workers who kicked off and were beating the Pakistani locals. So looking at Chabahar, it would be great if it could function, because Turkmenistan might actually be able to pump their gas through it. It keeps Baluchistan some jobs and keeps it somewhat stable. The Emiratis like it being, there as well, because it means that the Iranians don't go too crazy in the Strait of Hormuz. It doesn't make sense to go that hard on sanctions, because again, if the Americans wanted to break Iran, what comes after the government is not completely known. But generally, yeah, it's got away with it just for the fact that no one wants to see Baluchistan go too crazy.
So it's basically a check on that, and it's considered to be less of all potential evils at this point in time.
If Baluchistan was to sort of really kick off, and it was Baluch national movements would really get going, it would risk fracturing Pakistan into a number of pieces, because Baluch are quite a significant population, a significant territorial area inside Pakistan. And if Pakistan shatters or breaks into, because again, it's a very, very disconnected country. People from, Gilgit-Baltistan in the north or Baluch in the south are very, very different. And if that country fractures, you've got a four-way civil war in a country with nuclear weapons that will blame the Iranians and will blame the Afghans and will blame the Indians. And, if we don't have the Pakistani military in control, we don't have, the usual 3 or 4 families who run Pakistani politics, you would end up with likely very hardcore extremists taking power. And do you really want ISIS with nukes? Probably not. So a lot of people, particularly in the US, are very keen to make sure Pakistan stays stable. And if Chabahar has to stay open to keep that happen, have whatever you want, just keep Pakistan together, is probably what most people on anyone who's on the Pakistan desk will be telling you every day of the week.
It's interesting because there was another potential pipeline in discussion that would go through Pakistan, and that's separate and apart from the Chinese plans for it. What would that mean for the region if that were to happen?
It's a great idea, but the moment you start to hit problems of, who will fund it, who gives security on it, it's got to go through parts of Pakistan which aren't completely stable and will likely come under attack. What happens when the Pakistanis have a usual flare up with the Indians and shut off the gas? Because if you're India and you go, okay, this is a great pipeline, we should really build it up and we should get all our gas from Central Asia, and you get to a point where 60% of India's gas is coming in through this pipeline, what happens when Pakistan just turns it off? That would shut Indian power plants across the country. So Indian defense planners are really hesitant about it. Indian, foreign policy is really hesitant about it. Indian markets would also be a bit hesitant about it. And if you are an international investor, it's not a safe bet. I've had a few, energy companies and whatnot will ask me, hey, what's your analysis here? Do you think, if we built a pipeline, what's the chance that it gets attacked? I went, it's a coin flip. I would be pretty hesitant to say it would be safe, particularly if, local news stories break out or there's a drought and people start blaming outside companies, which quite often happens. The pipeline is a big shiny metal thing for them to blow up, and it will make a loud boom as well. So yeah, it's a great idea. I think it's a lot of very well-meaning people have signed that deal, but going into implementation, India will be hesitant to use it. Pakistan will be hesitant to build it. Iran will be hesitant to worry about what happens with sanctions, and the Central Asians will be hesitant to put their hopes in it.
Now it's interesting why Europe and the US are scrambling for additional sources of natural resources in light of the energy crisis and so on, and the policies in the US, which essentially we're turning to other countries instead of producing our own gas. The Central Asian countries are right there, and yet we do not see a lot of. We've seen various avenues being explored for potential energy routes. Of course, Azerbaijan has been a major partner with Qatar, but also Trinidad and Tobago, also Mozambique for France and Italy especially, and some other African countries. Not a lot has been said about Central Asia in that regard. Perhaps geography is key, but Africa is also not exactly next door, and certainly not from the US perspective. So why have Central Asian countries been overlooked in that regard?
So again, geography is the main problem here, because if you are going to say, yep, let's get lots of gas that power European homes with Turkmen and Kazakh gas. Okay, great, but that's got to go through Russian pipelines now. Mm-hmm. And then are the Russians pumping in Russian gas? They're pumping in Turkmen gas. It gets really iffy on how that would actually work, because if you can't, it's the same molecules coming down the pipe. Yeah, it's very hard to know who actually sent it. So that becomes a problem. If you want to go and actually get them across the Caspian, so build the Trans-Caspian pipeline, there's been a lot of attacks on pipeline infrastructure in that area by the Russians or by Russia-friendly people. Investors are really nervous about that. If you are making a big gas deal with your people or for your people, and you go, yes, this is perfect. You want to know that when you turn the switch, gas comes out. And if you know that 3 times a year it's going to come under attack and your country has 40% of their gas disappear overnight, not a good position to be in. So Central Asia would love to be part of that, but it would have to get the Trans-Caspian working, to which Azerbaijan really doesn't have much incentive to do so. Because right now they would love to pump their gas into Europe, not Central Asia's gas into Europe. Going through Russia, the pipelines are going to be sanctioned as is, so you can't get away with that one. So again, they're stuck with pumping it to Russia to be refined and sent to India or whatever, or they're stuck sending it to China because the pipelines at the moment head to China, and that's the way that geography has kind of really, really hurt Central Asia. As for the US would love to US natural gas to be the one that fills the European gap. Mostly through fracking, and effectively they've been building some very large terminals in South Carolina and whatnot to pump these out. But the main problem is terminals at the moment in Europe. So effectively, if you are in Europe, usually you just have the pipes coming in from Russia, that's fine. But right now, let's say you get gas from Qatar. The gas would need to be pumped out of the ground and then super cooled and then put into a ship, and that ship would have to go all the way around Qatar and go all the way through the Suez and all the way around Spain and all the way up to Rotterdam, and then would have to get into a terminal, to which Europe hasn't got much of the gas from ships for a while, so there's not many terminals. Compete for a terminal, get into the terminal, and then get off into the European markets, as compared to what it used to be, which was Russia flicked a switch. It will take a lot of pain and effort for the Europeans to effectively build up a whole bunch of infrastructure to allow terminals to come in. There's a lot of hope in pipelines from Algeria, but again, Algeria is not a particularly stable country. There's hope of pipelines from Libya. Libya is not a stable country. And there's the hopes of the Azeri pipes. But it's again not 100% bet, and at the same time, it's also much more expensive. And there's a problem of when gas is really high price, yep, it makes it actually competitive for Algeria and a few other countries to get involved in the gas market. But if the gas price drops to here, and in Russia it costs them this much to make gas, yeah, they're still making a profit. But for Angola or for Algeria, where it's costing this much to make the gas, they're now going bankrupt because the price is down here. And does Europe want to put all their faith in someone that could go bankrupt when the markets crash? Again, it's a real risk, because we've seen the damage that Europe is going through when a gas supply switches off. Do they really want to set themselves up for that with a Libya or an Algeria or potentially a Turkey and an Azerbaijan?
We are seeing then that a lot of the problem is not so much with the sources of energy, but with the infrastructure necessary to create that delivery. And one of the issues that we have seen a couple of times over the last few years is sabotage to the infrastructure. The preceding the Second Karabakh War was an attempted attack on Azerbaijani energy infrastructure, and now we are seeing that the Nord Stream has been damaged by mysterious forces in 4 different places, by underwater means that were very hard to detect and prevent that from happening. What can be said about this potential sabotage, even in some cases potentially political self-sabotage, if you're talking about Russia, which is not past doing things like that?
So I won't make too many comments on Nord Stream. I don't have enough information to make a good call on that yet. But
we are talking about the Russian pipelines in Central Asia, of course, because
what the big thing is here, that most of these pipelines will require not just government money, but they will require private investment as well. They'll need, let's say a pipeline that goes across the Trans-Caspian would likely be, Turkmen Gas, which is a state company, would likely chuck in some money, but you'd probably need Shell and BP or a few other countries to, put some money into it to get the project off the ground. When a pipeline is blown up, to every investor, it goes, whoa, what's going on? To actually fix the pipe, when a pipeline explodes, to fix it is not that expensive. Pipe's not that crazy, particularly if it's overground, you take a few bits, you replace them, all good to go. But investors are now scared away, because if you go, okay, where should I put my money? Well, Australia's more expensive, but I know it's very stable. And I know that if I put gas infrastructure in Australia, no one's blowing it up. If I put it in Turkmenistan, yes, it's only a third of the price, but I'm also not completely sure that, it won't get blown up. And a shareholder stock meeting might not kick me out because we've just lost a bunch of share price because all of our gas disappeared overnight, to which all of our customers now go, well, do I want to rely that heavily on Turkmen gas when it could be blowing up and I could be stuck with 2 weeks with no gas? Because terrorists will look at that and go, hey, if Europe gets 30% of their gas from Turkmenistan and they blow up a pipeline right as winter hits its coldest point, that's going to really hurt Europe. And Europe knows that, and Turkmens know that, and the terrorists know that. So it's a, as much as a small attack on infrastructure may not seem like a big deal, it's, it's out of action for 2 days, 3 days. To investors, it really does put a big question mark over it, going, is this safe enough to put a 20-year investment down on the table?
Now, that brings me to another point, that I have seen a surprising lack of not just consensus, but any sort of even exploration. A lot has been said about Russia and the nukes, but I've been consistently skeptical of those claims for various reasons. Not the least of them is, before going to this extreme resort, Russia has actually not undertaken far lesser measures that it could have, which includes conventional sabotage of energy sources in Ukraine proper. Before you go nuclear, there are many damaging things that Russia could have been doing, which it hasn't done. So let's talk about, do you see that it's why, first of all, it hasn't done those things, if it intended to pressure and terrorize the international community and increase the business risks for Ukraine and for the government and prop up its own resources? And do you see it actually going in that direction?
In the first couple of days of the war, the strikes on Ukraine were really precision strikes. They were at targeted military bases. They were at targeted airfields. They weren't attacking apartment buildings, because if I'm about to carjack someone, take their car, I'm not going to smash the windshield as I steal the car. Russia was hoping that the invasion would be very quick and they could just pop in and why smash the country up if you're about to take ownership of it? Now they realize that's not going to happen. It's a whole thing. Now they're much more blatant. They'll just use a lot of artillery shells. They're kind of going with a bit much more economic war. They're going, well, why would I fire a $10 million rocket to hit this particular airbase where we think there's people, than just kind of lobbing 150 World War II style, artillery shells at it, because it'll fall down anyway. As for nuclear weapons, that's a huge move by the Russians if they go down that road. And I think once that Pandora's box is open, you can't shut it. I don't think the Russians would. But again, the message is not for you, it's not for me, it's not for Ukraine, it's not even for the US. It will be effectively messaged at the Slovaks and the Bulgarians and some of the Poles, maybe not probably the Poles, but the Hungarians particularly, with them going, well, what if there is nukes? Is it worth this war? I love you, Ukraine, I'm sorry this happened to you, but I'm not willing to risk nuclear war, and they might back off. And that's the hope Russia has. Whether it'll be successful, pretty hard to know, and I don't think it will. But yeah, that's effectively, it's a nice little bluster to try and convince some of these countries that are more on the fence about the war in Ukraine that it's time to pull out. And particularly with the new government coming in Italy, that's another one who will likely be eating up that message. But yeah, it's for people like yourself who are following it very closely, for people like me, the Americans, we know that's bluster. To a scared mum in Hungary who is a bit worried about this thing, that message is very much going to be sitting in the back of her mind.
Now, we have seen that economic warfare can have very significant role in conflicts. We have seen attacks on infrastructure, on oil infrastructure in South Yemen, for instance, and we have certainly seen attacks on Aramco facilities, which, by the way, despite their frequency, have not deterred the investors from working with Saudi Arabia. Why would that make? What can we expect from further, from increasingly more desperate Russia forces in Ukraine with regards to that? Do you see any internal increase in internal sabotage attacks to prevent Ukrainian forces from regaining control of those territories? Do we see more of this economic warfare to kind of deter investors and NATO forces from taking advantage of Ukraine's offer to sell gas to Germany, for instance?
Very much so. There's been a lot of attacks on Ukrainian power grids, on Ukrainian sewerage systems, on Ukrainian infrastructure, telecommunications. It's now, particularly if you're east of the Dnieper, everything has come under attack at some point. They're leaving Kiev alone a little for the most part because the foreign dignitaries have returned. Lviv as well is being left alone because the foreign dignitaries have returned. The Russians kind of are realizing that if you bomb some Ukrainian town with 400 people, no one's going to make too much noise. Accidentally kill a diplomat in Kiev, well, that's other countries going to have to respond. As for attacking infrastructure, yeah, they'll do whatever they can to make it as painful as they can for Ukraine. Much like they did when they were losing the war in Afghanistan. They did some very painful things on the way out of that one too. But effectively, we're now looking down the barrel of one of four scenarios. We're looking at a Afghanistan situation where effectively they pack up, leave, and run back over the border. I think that's quite unlikely at this point. Putin's very invested. Two is a Syria situation where we end up with just this endless war where there's hot fighting all the time. Option three is that Ukraine, or is it the Crimea situation where effectively they annex it and other countries go, I don't like it, but yeah, I get it and it's fine. This is where we'll draw the line and that's it, which I guess, some countries may go along with. I don't think, the West will. A quite likely looking option seems like it might be almost a Transnistria broken, a frozen republic kind of situation where, you have this front line that just sits there, technically Transnistria, which is a breakaway Republic of Moldova. They've been at war for, they technically have a ceasefire, but it's not really a peace deal. They've been at war since 91. And it just kind of sits there. There's a de facto border, as you cross from Kishinev to Tiraspol, there is There are guys there who check your passports, and they have Russian army uniforms, and they speak Russian, and they act Russian, and there's Russian tanks there. But the UN would recognize it as part of a Moldova. I think Russia is starting to hope that maybe it can pull, a breakaway republic style thing here, the same way they have in South Ossetia and Georgia, South Ossetia and Abkhazia in Georgia, the same way they have in Transnistria and Moldova. Will it work? I don't think so. I think, the Moldovans have much less capacity to defend themselves. Same with the Georgians. The Ukrainians seem pretty determined on this one, but there's still a lot in the air. And I don't know how far Russia is to go, because obviously they didn't want to start World War III over this. No one wants to trade Kharkiv for Moscow.
In the meantime, Russia still has the means to continue fighting, despite the fact that they're desperately throwing really old people now into Ukraine, and all sorts of characters who shouldn't necessarily be there, such as protesters who have the least incentive to stay loyal while fighting the war they were protesting against to begin with. Doesn't really make much sense to me. Still, Russia is able to continue to get by on the energy money it's making from various and assorted countries. One of the issues here has been the lack of unity on the sanctions front. Russia has been able to deal with Gulf states, with various with India, of course, with China, although China has withdrawn some investments over secondary sanctions concerns, and of course Latin America and other parts of the world. US and NATO have so far failed to unify most of the international community. Yes, Russia is being seen as increasingly a weakened state, and increasingly some world leaders have expressed their displeasure over what's going on, but so far we have not yet seen a significant shift over Russia's weakness to the pro-Western, pro-NATO sanctions camp. Do you see that happening? What do you think would take to make that happen?
Again, it's a lot of these countries don't have too much of a choice, and to sanction Russia would be too far. A really classic example is the Indians. So the Indians approached the Americans about buying American arms under the Trump administration, and Trump went, "We'll only sell you them if you 100% shift to American arms." To which the Indians went, "No, A, too expensive, and B, our entire military usually runs on quite a lot of Russian military equipment, and without cutting Russia off, we wouldn't have any spare parts to fix any of our tanks. So if a tank breaks a gearbox, that's it, tank's gone." A lot of these countries still have ties like that with Russia, that effectively, Russia still gives them parts of their planes or parts of their tanks or energy at a good cost, or frankly, will just give them a vote at the UN Security Council. They still have that right as well. So Russia is able to do other things that the Americans, I don't think, can bluster too hard. A lot of countries will also go, what advantage do I get on completely siding with the Americans versus playing, having my cake and eating it too? Kazakhstan, as we just circle back to the very start of the conversation, is in that exact position. They would love to have a great relationship with the Americans, but what do they gain from poking the Russians in the eye? Not a lot. And the Americans haven't offered huge incentives to a lot of these countries to jump ship. What could the Americans offer Saudi Arabia to actually cut the Russians off? It would have to be a lot, because the Russians are very helpful with Saudis.
As we have seen, that has been minimal. The cooperation has actually come to a relatively, that is still. But, over the past 10, 15, 20 years, I would say, US foreign policy with respect to incentivizing alliances has been relatively ineffective. Part of it may be
That's a good way to put it,
and we have seen both Republican and Democrat administrations come to agreements on many of these things in terms of both being equally ineffective, sometimes in different and sometimes in very similar ways pursuing. Afghanistan policy has been pursued, there hasn't been a strategic reevaluation throughout all these past, I would say, at least 4 administrations that I can count on.
It's a toughie for you can point to, let's say, American investments in Tanzania, where the Chinese came in and built power stations and railroads and ports, and the Americans built a dive center and a movie theater and a bar in a country that was majority Muslim. And, it's just showing that they didn't really do their intelligence as well as they probably should have. It's things like funding, intelligence agencies in Mozambique, but only staffing them with people who speak Portuguese and English. So they're not useful in the Swahili or the, other language parts of the country. It also really hurts the Americans at the moment. It's something I've heard from quite a few ambassadors in the kind of second and third world, is this, once they tore up the JCPOA, which is the Iran nuclear deal, ambassadors go, look, we're happy with Biden. We think Biden's doing a good job. He's a solid shooter. He's always been good with foreign policy. But if I sign a deal with the Americans, what happens when President Tucker Carlson comes in 2024, or, some other Republican comes in and just tears it up? Like, if I sign a deal with China or Russia, I don't like them, but at least I know that deal's 20 years long. With the Americans now, we've broken the cardinal rule of foreign policy, which is foreign policy politics should stop at the shoreline. That, doesn't matter what party you are, you do what you need to do. Whereas now, any deal signed with the Americans, may not even last one term, because it may get torn up when the other party comes into power. And that's a pretty daunting thing for the US to get over at the moment.
Admittedly, much of that has been due to the fact that a lot of the policy, both domestic and foreign, has been via executive order versus treaty level agreements that are much harder to break. JCPOA would never have made it as a treaty. It was never submitted to be that. So the question is it worth entering agreements that are not fully enforceable to begin with, in general terms? But on the question of Russia, we have seen a great deal of bipartisanship, and despite a minority of noisy Tucker Carlson type voices from both sides of the aisle, but overall it has been pretty much one of the rare, more recently rare consensus that kind of, because this type of situation is the closest to the Cold War, which is familiar to US politics. This emerging divergent threats and dealing with the kind of with all these countries may not be quite as familiar, at least not on a political level, maybe on operational level, but not so far. And US intelligence seems to have shifted a lot away from focusing on human kind of sources and assessment of on the ground situations to I'm not sure what exactly, to be honest. Counterterrorism, I guess, but
it's a trend everywhere. It's really interesting as a guy whose background is in Russia and ex-Soviet affairs and speaking Russian and doing a lot of work in this area. Until effectively this year, my work with the Australian government was, you'd ask the Russian government what their Australia policy is, and they go, yes, I'm pretty sure we have a map somewhere of you guys. I don't really know. When you ask the Australians what their Russia policy, they go, I think we do some trade with them. We're not really sure. Everyone who, most of the people have left, and they're all on the China desk or the Middle East desks or the Africa desks, or, the Russia guys are either old hands who've been there since the Soviet Union, or a handful of kind of, people like me who are interested in the region. It's been an absolute culture shock that effectively all this infrastructure and all the good experts who just put all their Russia books down for 20 years and are now on China books gone, oh my God, okay, we need someone who speaks Russian and can do Russian. And it's been really interesting to watch this huge pivot back to actually taking Russia seriously. Obviously the NATO infrastructure is still there, so that's been pretty useful. But yeah, it's really interesting to see this other US pivot back to figuring out what to do about Russia. But again, I hope they don't take their eye off the ball on Asia as well.
It's interesting because US has been trying to pivot to different things. It's been trying to pivot to Asia. It's been trying to pivot out of the Middle East. It's been trying to pivot towards, I guess, dealing with China, but really it hasn't fully pivoted anywhere because, first of all, politics are globalized now. So China is in the Middle East. Russia is very much in the Middle East and successfully wooing away allies to circumvent sanctions, for instance. US has not been able to leave the Middle East, but it has also not transitioned towards Asia to the extent it should, if it's serious about that, for what it's worth, or China or Russia for that matter. So I don't really see a committed policy to any particular region, area, whether it's geopolitical, or whatever. There's this isolationism that's against nation building, and then there's this all, people who are completely against sanctions. It's a really weird political moment that makes it very hard to develop a coherent response to any particular threat.
Again, because a lot of US foreign policy at the moment is being decided 2 or 3 years at a time. Sanctions, effectively, if sanctions are now depending on which country and what your alignment is. The US also don't want to get too involved in some things. They want to get involved in others. I mean, there are so many conflicts in Africa that the US could come in and solve very quickly and then get out. But that would also, you'd probably have, let's say, 3 or 4 American soldiers who would die in that conflict, and that would be national use, and it would be the next Benghazi. It also Afghanistan, still hangs on everyone's minds that what a terrible thing that was, and we don't want to get too involved. So they need to, still be the guys who are, backing everyone and helping everyone and doing everything they need to do to keep their position as effectively the world police. But at the same time, there's no political will to get, on the ground boots doing stuff. So it's a really difficult position, to be in. And I don't think they should invade everyone. And I also don't think they should be isolationist. I don't even have the answer of, that middle balance of where the US should be and shouldn't be.
Because I think a lot of it has been very much reduced to invasions versus nothing. I think there's a great deal of policy that can be done in the middle in conjunction with local actors, providing significant logistical support, but also involving private actors to make it less burdensome on taxpayers and not make it seem like a never-ending, nation building. Maybe having more private actors is better for nation building anyway than having endless government functionaries, and corrupt contractors. But there's got
the trouble is the US have so many options they can point to. They can go, we'll just do airstrikes. That's all we'll do. We're not going to go boots on the ground. And then you end up with Libya. Okay, well, we'll just train locals. And then you end up with Syria, where they spent a whole bunch of money and got no real good fighters out of it. Okay, well, we'll put boots on the ground. And then you end up with Iraq. It's every time the US have tried something, it's not gone well.
But the problem is when you don't try anything, other actors come in and it gets even worse.
If you don't try anything, you end up with Rwanda. It's where if the US had gone in 94 very quickly and isolated some of these groups between them, that genocide would not have hit the place it did, and they didn't. And we ended up with what the horrifying events of 94. It's a really interesting conundrum that the US has, where if they get involved, they're either stuck there sorting it out, or they get there and they go, well, okay, we're going to be there for 90 days. And then every terrorist goes, sweet, I'm going to wait 90 days. And you end up with a situation like the Afghans where they go, well, you have the watches, but we have the time. And when you announce, hey, we're going to be leaving at some point, they go, okay, we'll just wait till you leave. Why would we waste all our men fighting when we're just wait an extra year and we'll have the country anyway? And again, but no US president wants to commit to, I will put boots on the ground and we'll be in Mozambique until the job is done, because that's when is that job actually completely ever done?
Well,
it's a real conundrum.
I would say, I think just thinking in terms of boots on the ground is the key problem, because most of the fighting is ideological, information, psychological, and not just, the terrorism are the terrorists that end up there, they're the result. They're not the cause. The cause is always either ideology or some sort of a geopolitical policy by whatever group, state or non-state actor. And those are the key issues that can be resolved through a combination of means, not just through military means. And these are the ones that are not being tackled until it becomes a military situation, and where, and even then, just solving the military situation does not solve necessarily the conflict. It solves a particular counterterrorism concern for the time being, but not the rudimentary counter-extremism concern. And perhaps reframing the discussion in those terms is what's necessary to avoid Afghanistan type and Iraq type situations.
Even be able to build infrastructure. So the classic example everyone points to is after the Afghans, the Mujahideen support, and the Afghans have pushed out the Russians. They spent billions of dollars to get shoot down helicopters in for the Russians, really hurt the Russians. And then when the guys who ran those operations came to the US Congress and said, okay, you've given us $1 billion, we've shot down a bunch of helicopters. Now we're at a point where over half the country is under the age of 18. You know, they are poor, they have no water, and they have no schools left. Give us $1 million and we'll build a bunch of schools and educate the next generation. And Congress went, what's the point? You know, either we give the $1 million and then we get accused of handing money to, you know, extremist forces, or we don't. And well, that's not my problem. I'm only in Congress for 3 years. Don't worry about it. And that effectively, it meant that the entire generation of Afghans that came up after that didn't have the education, and because they didn't have the education, they turned to extremists. They didn't, you know, the country didn't flourish, didn't breed this whole generation of engineers and people to really build the country's infrastructure, which had been decimated by the Russians. You know, the US always kind of, you know, can bomb and they can blow up and they can do whatever they want, which is great. But building schools and railroads and building infrastructure, because again, middle-class accountants are much less likely to grab an RPG. That takes time and money and effort and a long commitment to do so. You know, you look at the US Marshall Plan, for instance, where they took the time, they took 10 years, they took decades and just pumped money into, you know, Europe to make sure, you know, it built education, it built school, it built railroads, it built infrastructure, you know, and it's why that Europe is much more US friendly now. You know, even the countries like Greece, which took on Marshall Plan funding, versus, you know, Yugoslavia, who didn't, you can see the differences. You know, it's a long project, it's an expensive project, and I don't think it's one that the US has really the money or the appetite to go, okay, let's commit to building every single country up in the world, and we're gonna make every single country have water, and let's do this, that'll be great. And there'll be no backlash, and we won't have to work with, you know, all sorts of dictators to do so anyway. It's a complicated situation. It really is.
So in that case, let's limit ourselves to something fairly specific, which is Central Asia and the consequences of the current war in Ukraine. What can US and other countries, Western countries, do to optimize their relationships with these actors that are kind of stuck there, to first of all be the most productive of those relationships possible, and second, to of course offset the impact of adversarial actors coming in and grabbing what they can in terms of resources, human relationships, and geographical impact?
Again, the answer is money, and that's the trouble. You know, if you don't want China to have any influence in Kyrgyzstan, build roads in Kyrgyzstan. You know, because when you have, you know, you hear this all the time from diplomats in particularly South America, where they'll have the US come in at 9 a.m. and they'll say, don't you take Chinese money, it's bad money and it's got debt, and don't do it, don't you dare do it, and they'll leave the office. And then at 11 o'clock, the Chinese will come in and say, hey, do you want 100 billion to build some railroads? And you go, oh man, like, I know you're not great, but rhetoric doesn't build highways. So you end up just taking the Chinese money. And the US right now are offering, you know, moral support. They're offering some things, but when you've got China coming into your office and offering you, hey, where do you want highways? I'll build your highways. I'll build your railroads. You take that deal. If the US really wanted Central Asia to be, you know, US friendly and really, you know, waving the stars and stripes, they'd be building schools and railroads and hospitals and infrastructure and effectively, you know, going in that area, because the youth who, you know, in these areas, they actually probably would prefer the US over China. You know, it's an area ripe for investment. It's an area that there can be great paybacks on investment, but no one's got the interest to do so, because again, the US go, well, even if we get, you know, a car factory built in Uzbekistan, which is great, who's going to buy the cars? How are you going to get the cars? Well, you know, it's not worth the money. And they've just handed that to private companies. Go, well, private companies can invest, and private companies don't, because there's still a reputation that the governments, if there's a coup, will just seize the companies and hand it for themselves, as well as the fact that, you know, getting anything out to market is problematic. You know, right now with the US sanctioning Russia, if you are, you know, if I just put $10 billion into a car company in Uzbekistan, I'd be freaking out, because I go, okay, I was hoping those cars could go to Europe, but now they have to go into Russia and they might be sanctioned. Okay, now I have no way to get my cars there. Great. I'm out of $10 billion. And that's, you know, again, we're talking very large sums of money here that are required, and companies that will have to make 20-year calls. And Central Asia is an area where not a lot of people know a lot about, and not a lot of people have all the confidence to go in and do 20-year deals.
Quite ironically, US is spending a great deal of money around the world on assorted projects, but most of them are short-term, changeable, and don't have a lasting impact. Perhaps instead of talking about cutting off all aid completely, it should shift the resources it's already spending on more durable and more practical investments.
Yeah, I mean, short term, it's always that debate. So your long term projects are always the ones that will make much better impact on the community. To actually build a whole network of railroads makes a huge impact, but it's a 20-year investment, and you don't know which if the next party will come in and effectively cut that deal off, because U.S. foreign policy is flipping politically now. You don't know if the regime, you may have a coup in 5 years and some horrifying dictator comes into power, and now you're funding his railroads so he can divert that money to go kill more of his citizens. Not a great look for the US. In long-term funding, by the time we get to that point, US guys going, well, will Central Asia be relevant in 20 years? I think it will, but a lot of people may not think that. And what if China just, builds in, takes its infrastructure anyway, or becomes the big player in here and just kind of, convinces the oligarchs to push out the US companies, and they just build the last bits on top of our stuff and they get the credit for it. I agree, long-term investment is what people should be doing, but it's long commitments in foreign policy. And if you think what 20 years ago foreign policy was, we just had 9/11, we were entering the Middle East, it was going to be everything about the Middle East. And here we are 20 years later, and everyone's trying to get out of the Middle East.
And having accomplished basically nothing, which is why, I'm raising questions where, if you don't have the patience to see any one thing through, you're not going to succeed at anything. China has the same, but it's in the same position. It is also concerned about having its infrastructure blown up by terrorists. It's so it also runs the risks of losing influences if some other party comes to power in whatever. But yet it seems to find a way around these arguments, and
because China has a lot more state companies, particularly in industries like rare earths and mining. China can afford to lose some money, because it's not if a Chinese mine loses money for, and this is a classic example with rare earths, where China can go, okay, let's really get in on this market. We'll lose money for like 10 years. All of the private companies in the US and Europe will go bankrupt because they're shareholders. They actually they have to make a profit. They go bankrupt, they leave the market, and China goes, cool, I'm the only one left. And they can put their prices back up to where they were, because it's a very long-term plan thinking. If you're doing what the US do, which is usually rely on private companies to carry out the operations, if they go bankrupt and they need to spend a bunch of money, either the US has to bail them out, which is very expensive because you're private companies, or they have to admit defeat and throw in the towel. And that looks even worse when you've gone, look at the Afghanistan ring road as an example. They spent God knows how much, estimates are somewhere around the $500 million to build one road around Afghanistan. But they got private companies to do most of it. And look, where we have maybe maybe 2/3 of it left, maybe. It's been a failure. And that's another sort of trouble, that if you have private companies, China can afford to lose money for 10 years, and US companies are out of business in 2, because they have shareholder meetings who go, no, not making money, I'm out.
It's kind of the classic decision-making dilemma that also faces NGOs and charitable foundations. Do you give a whole bunch of money to many diverse different places around the world, or do you choose strategically a few and invest a lot and stay there until you see the impact? Perhaps the middle ground here is to be selective about where you put your money, but to do what it takes to make sure at least something succeeds, which makes it easier to succeed in other places at the end of the day.
Very much so. It's they'd like to be everywhere, but being everywhere costs a lot of money. And now the US has to decide where, okay, do I put all my eggs in South America? Do I put them in the Middle East? Do I put them into Russia? Do I put them into, it's a lot of decisions to make at the moment, and no answer is right. I tell everyone who's sort of first year international relations that the answer to every geopolitical question should always be, well, it's complicated.
I agree with that, but thank you for delving into these complications with me here. I know it's not always what people want to hear. they want to hear, well, if we just do this, then it will be solved, or we should just get out, or we should just throw the money but it's not that simple, but it's certainly worth considering these options instead of hiding from them, which is what I appreciate. Thank you
very much so. I appreciate you having me on. It was fantastic to chat with you on this one.
Thank you so much. And everyone watching us, this was Michael Hilliard from Australia, journalist, foreign policy advisor, and host of podcasts delving into foreign policy, geopolitics, and of course, Central Asia. We will be back next week at the usual time, Tuesday, 9 p.m. And this was Irina Zuckerman with the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. Thank you for watching.
Thanks so much.